All right, so I'll tell you a little, I'll start you off with the ETC stuff, and then Colin will take over from there. I'm sure all of you are very well aware, so I'll just skim over this really quickly, but what is Ethereum Classic? Essentially, prior to July 2016, Ethereum and Ethereum Classic were the same chain. In June of 2016, there was a DAO hack, where there was a bug in smart contracts that held a lot of Ethereum, and there was a disagreement in the community in terms of how to move forward from this. And because we couldn't come to a consensus, one chain decided to return the funds and the other decided not to. They split, and then we had two chains, Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. So what we're talking about now is Ethereum Classic, and I'll talk to you more about the work that we've done. So essentially, since that split, the Ethereum codebase has obviously progressed a lot. A lot of EIPs have been, Ethereum implement proposals have been implemented, and those changes were not necessarily reflected in Ethereum Classic because obviously it's its own network now with its own clients. And so it's very important now, at least from Ethereum Classic's perspective, to make these networks more interoperable. That was one of their priorities. And so in order to make more of these networks interoperable again, we had to implement changes from some of the hard forks in Ethereum, specifically Byzantium and Constantinople. And so we took these changes and actually implemented them in the code base of Ethereum Classic. And so for Ethereum Classic, these hard forks are actually called Atlantis, which is Byzantium, and Agartha, which is Constantinople. And just the state of these hard forks, so essentially both of these have been fully implemented. Atlantis has been fully implemented, and updates included some crypto precompiles and some EVM optimizations. All testing, extensive testing had been done, and the hard fork occurred in September of 2019. And Agartha, which was a bit smaller, had a few EIPs implemented, which included bitwise shifting and create2. And extensive testing occurred in the fall, and the hard fork actually happened about a month ago in January. I think this project actually taught us a lot. I really like the term, or the quote, "smooth seas never made a skillful sailor," because we were literally pulling out our hair for like a week with this project. And essentially it was during the testing phase, because the implementation was fairly straightforward. These were already implemented in Ethereum, so we just were able to use a lot of that code. But the testing was really hard. So we actually released it on 3 testnets. Kensington, which was our own testnet, and that's a neighborhood that's very close to our office, and then Cottey and Morden. And essentially, in order to test it, we built a tool to programmatically test all the opcodes through a comprehensive set of transactions and contracts. So this was like some auxiliary tool that would just like send transactions onto these networks and see what happened. And one of the challenges was that a full sync of the network, at least for the more established testnets, that longer running testnets, took 5 days. So it's like you'd make one little change and then you'd wait 5 days to figure out like if this actually did anything or helped you. And so when there's an actual problem, that was like quite frustrating, because you can't just like quickly change something and see if it helped. And then we had one major bug that was like really difficult to figure out, and obviously it turned out to be a super simple thing. It was actually a bug on just one testnet, which was Morden, which is a very old Ethereum testnet. And it was weird that it was only happening on one testnet and not the others, even though we were doing the same things on all 3 testnets. And honestly, that should have been the place we started. But obviously, we tried everything else before thinking about the differences between these testnets. But essentially, what we did is like we tried decompiling the transactions that were causing the fork. We fixed unrelated tests. We literally investigated all the EIPs that had ever happened to see if they could kind of give us a clue. But in the end, what it was actually a difference in the testnet itself. So when Morden was created, in order to prevent replay attacks, which is like copying a transaction from another chain and then just putting it onto, like say for example, copying it from a testnet and putting it onto Ethereum, they implemented a starting nonce, which is just a counter. So the counter on Morden actually starts from like some very high number rather than 0. So each account has this starting nonce. And so for Morden, in order to prevent replay attacks, they started at a high number, and so this actually caused the conflict, and which is why we were only getting this fork on Morden rather than getting it on the other testnet. So it was literally like a one-line change, and it worked after that, and so we were all very relieved. But that was definitely a challenge and something we learned a lot from. And the other thing I want to touch on is, building on these blockchains or developing updates is not necessarily the hard part. We learned a lot about how important it is to navigate through a community because there's so many different parties that are invested both financially and emotionally and have their own desires for the future. And like we were very involved or like we're at least able to see this sort of thing for the first time as an organization. And so it's definitely something we learned a lot from. And so I will let Colin talk about our other work on Ethereum Classic.
Yeah. I'm going to get this very quickly because we are running behind a little. So we were more recently than the work that Amer just spoke about. ChainSafe was contracted by ETC Co-op to upgrade the Hyperledger Besu client, formerly Pegasus, to be ETH Classic compatible. And Hyperledger Besu is an open source Ethereum client, and it's written in Java. So the initial work we did for this project, we added some functionality, such as the ability to parse and validate additional fields. We developed a new gas calculator, and we integrated DAO hard fork support. And more recently, we've been implementing Aslan, which is the ETH Classic version of ETHDenver hard fork, or at least within that client. And some aspects of that are still under discussion by the community, so it hasn't been released yet. But so far we've implemented 5 major updates, 3 gas calculation updates, and 2 opcode additions. And we should expect this to be coming out in the next few months. Yeah, that's it for ETH Classic. Woo!